I'm really going to go for it because I am so worried about the prospect of self-identification of gender for children and young people. I think that it's extraordinarily dangerous, and I just want to kind of infect the room with a sense of that danger. It's an incredibly difficult topic to discuss. I've worked for over 30 years on inclusive education, talking about how to include any child with any determinant of identity, be it sex, disability, poverty, race, how they want to express their gender. But since I started to openly call for a careful discussion about what's going on with children self-identifying as transgender, I'm constantly attacked in my work. I'm called exclusionary, TERF, transphobic, accused of promoting hate. And I'm actually the target of several organised campaigns to break my career and silence me. So it's really important to me that I try not to let that happen. This all came to a head in 2016 when I produced a book with Heather Bronscall-Evans, who you all know and love, about these issues. We brought together people from the UK and the US to talk about their concerns and produce this book, which is calling for a sensible discussion. And I mentioned the book not really just to flog it, but to assure you that I've done some really deep and serious thinking and research about these issues. I know a lot about it. And I also want to say at the outset, there's absolutely no contradiction between my respect for adults who want to live as transgender and my conviction that self-identification of gender is harmful for children and young people. So what do I know? Well, more and more parents are asking me for advice about their children. And I'm going to talk tonight just mainly about girls. Girls who identify themselves as transgender out of the blue. We're starting to call this rapid onset gender dysphoria. Teenagers usually who've been struggling to fit in, lots of them on the autistic spectrum. But I keep hearing stories of schools transitioning children without their parents' consent. So this, it turns out, is in line with guidance that organisations who are influencing schools, Stonewall, Mermaids and Gendered Intelligence, are pushing in school, where they're claiming that a child's confidentiality must remain uppermost, and therefore parents need not be told if a child is self-identifying as transgender. So a parent who talked to me from a school not so far from here, found out that school had transitioned her daughter to a boy when she went to parents' evening and was told that her daughter had been re-registered from the start of the academic year as her son. Yeah. Now that's not far from here. It's all over the country. And another family talked to me about their 15-year-old daughter who told her teacher that her parents didn't agree that she was really a boy. And this all escalated so that social services were called. It ended up with this family losing their much-loved daughter to foster care, where she was able to live as a boy. But as part of this story, the deputy head teacher had said to that family that he was powerless to intervene. He said to them, off the record, I know she's not a boy, but she's self-identified, so my hands are tied. And I'm hearing these stories all around the country and actually all around the world. A few years later, since that book came out, we've got a rise of 4,500% in girls identifying as transgender over this decade. I think we really need to talk about what's going on. There's going to be a government inquiry and we need to take notice of that. I think most people nowadays who've got teenage children know of a transgender child. There's one in every school, one in every class. But all of this, for me, poses really serious questions about whether there's any validity to transgender self-identification or whether there's social contagion. Mainly because children self-identify as transgender in friendship groups and in clusters. So that makes me think, is there some social contagion factor here? I've advised on the research published recently by Lisa Lippman, who has got a lot of evidence of social contagion, but her data has been forced into censorship by activists who say that there must be no debate about this issue of self-identification of gender for children. Apart from the Royal College of Psychiatrists, all the major professional bodies in this country, including our big teacher unions, have signed a memorandum of understanding that frames the asking of questions about a child's self-identification as transgender as amounting to conversion therapy. It very much reminds me of what Jean is saying, because most of those teachers and GPs and so on are saying they weren't really consulted, they don't know how this MOU's got through. But nonetheless, if a GP or a teacher wants to talk to a child about their trans identification, they can't ask questions, because then they are in breach of the MOU. We have to go with the mantra, if a child identifies as trans, they are trans, no questions asked. Well, I'm not really up for no questions. Again, as Gina was saying, nobody's telling me what to ask. Online, children who simply ask questions in trans forums, such as Tumblr, all the ones that the kids use, about whether they might be trans, saying, oh, I think maybe I am. They're told, if you think you might be, you probably are. And they're initiated into thinking that if they delay their announcement of their transgender identity, they might start to feel suicidal. Yeah? Right? And typically, the advice that comes to parents, including from the NHS, is you must affirm your child's self-identification as transgender. The child will become depressed if you don't. They might become suicidal if they don't. If you love your child, let them take the hormones, including the puberty blockers. Let them bind their breasts and break their ribs. Prepare for surgeries as soon as you can. I'm just so worried that there's a lack of dialogue here. This business of not being able to ask questions creates considerable risk of children and young people being blindsided into self-identification as transgender, and then not being able to turn to anybody who might help them explore that, or even possibly, heaven forbid, change their mind, as 80% of them do. Parents are certainly worried that children are not transgender just because they say they are. Yeah? But that is transphobic if you're one of those parents. You're supposed to say they are transgender if they say they are. But we know 2/3 of children who identify, teenagers who say they want to change sex, have previously been identified with mental health disorders. We know that 35% of the children referred to Tavistock Gender Clinic are on the autistic spectrum. We know, I've already said, that 80% desist if they're left to their own devices and turn out usually to be lesbian or gay young people. But if a child publicly self-identifies as transgender, then they rapidly find themselves on this medical pathway with very little possibility for getting off it or for changing your mind, because belief in self-identification of gender renders any support you might offer as conversion therapy. I think it's really problematic that self-identification of gender is fixing children in a one-way street. In my opinion, self-identification of gender is not a safe proposition for children and young people, and we have to start asking questions. The idea that self-identification of your gender is liberating, I think, in fact, is dangerously hostile as the ordinary gender freedoms become unavailable to you. You have to identify gender. You have no gender freedom. Self-identification of gender does not, in my view, best serve the interests of children and young people. Rather, it opens up the way for transgender teaching to normalise dissociation from your natural body and fix the child on a medical and pharmacological intervention pathway for life. I am amazed at how many people are horrified once I start talking, but we are silenced. We have to break out of the silence somehow. And I know that's not easy to do, because you too will be sent to your Human Resources Committee. Go there, I've been there, it's not much fun. So here are some of my immediate concerns. For the past 10 years, people who want to promote transgender ideology and self-identification of gender have had unparalleled access to British schools. Really, no other group has had the kind of unrivaled access that they have to children. And children are involved in conversations concerning their gender identity in primary school, probably before they even understand very much about sex or about gender at all. And then, if those children are given any reason to question the things they like or to question the way they're behaving, the question of whether the child was born in the wrong body starts to arise. Yeah? And if a child continues with liking things that adults identify as belonging to the other gender, yeah, then a child, a girl liking football, wearing sports clothes, that kind of thing, then concern starts to nudge along a process of the child feeling first that they should be socially reassigned to a boy. And ultimately, in the long run, that means physical reassignment. Now, this is really bothering me. For a child to self-identify as transgender, all that's needed is for enough adults to agree the child is in the wrong body. So whose self-identification is that? Adults, I think, often have a vested interest in supporting children to self-identify as trans. Trans advocacy is intensely tied up with homophobia. There are so many young lesbians now who are re-identifying as trans men because they say it's easier to be a straight guy than a gay girl. There are adults who have, some trans adults, who have a vested interest in lobbying very hard for self-identification of children in order to naturalise their own gender preferences and their own sexual preferences. I think self-identification of gender is a tool that's pushing children and young people to serve regressive gender stereotypes and adult agendas of sexual entitlement. To boost public sympathy, some people say to me, oh, come on, the issues of transgender children are the same as the issues of disabled children, and you're really being very unkind here. I absolutely refute that proposition. We've learned from disabled people themselves over many decades that they want support for living in their own body with minimal medicalisation, and they particularly don't want medicalisation that brings lifelong complications. However, the transitioning of children and young people who self-identify as transgender actually insists on medicalisation, even though there's no evidence base on the safety of outcomes. So, for example, the long-term effects of puberty blockers are not known. We do not know if changes caused by taking testosterone, such as your voice deepening, you're getting the male pattern baldness and vaginal atrophy and all those things. We don't know if they're reversed when you stop taking testosterone. This is an experiment on the bodies of our children. But we do know that fertility is compromised, that a hysterectomy is required after a couple of years taking tea, the kids say, as if it's nothing, and that there's a lifelong need for blood transfusions and so on. And then if you have the surgeries, there's infection, there's scars, there's PTSD, there's the whole lot. So we really need to think very carefully about this. And what really bothers me is that 80% of trans-identifying adults don't insist on medicalisation for themselves. Oh, right. So there's no evidence base for safe medical transition. But parents who worry about that are told, well, you've got to do it anyway. You've got to have the medicalised approach for your child. This negates over 30 years of campaigning by disabled people who understand that children are not oppressed by their bodies, but are oppressed by the barriers they face to inclusion. And there's such an easy idea there that would enable us to support these gender-confused children without harm. In my view, no child is born in the wrong body. Self-identification of gender is illusory. It's a social construct. I argue that self-identity is brought on by the things people say. A backdrop of media, the internet, the increasing role of trans-affirmative ideas in schools for children that affect the teachers and the parents, and even by medicine itself, because uncritical medical practice is recycling the idea that the cause of misaligned gender resides in the body. Yeah? So actually, even though medical interventions bring lifelong physical and psychological difficulties that will actually deepen gender-based dissatisfaction and never actually change a person's biological sex, we seem to be kind of going on along with this as if it's all very fine. I don't think it is. If I'm right, and transgender identity is iatrogenic, I mean by that, if it comes from the things that people say, especially doctors, then I'm also right to say that self-identification of gender is a dangerous push to deny children and young people ordinary gender freedoms. It's not, in my view, coincidental that children's interests are being undermined by the idea of self-identification. There are a lot of stakeholders, including Big Pharma, who want them to identify as transgender and who don't want anybody to ask any sensible questions. Very conveniently, puberty blockers and hormone therapy compound gender confusion. First, the child misses out on the puberty of their peers. Next, an already confused girl has a vagina and a beard. The only way forward is more treatment to allegedly relieve gender dysphoria. Yeah? But the detransitioners that I'm working with and the people who regret transitioning tell us that gender dysphoria doesn't go away with medical intervention. Yeah, because it doesn't reside in the body, does it? I'm so clever. So my critique is not about exclusion. It's about inclusion. It's about allowing every girl to live her own kind of femininity without being excluded from her own body and without being excluded from the female sex class. And it's about inclusion so that any boy who wants to wear pink dresses to school can do that and not be excluded from his own body and his own sex class. I think it all hinges on kind of one idea that I'll finish with here. The seriousness, I think, of understanding this is key. And that's the idea that children are born in the wrong body, that gender is biological and sex isn't, and that children should be allowed to self-identify their sex and their gender functions as a tool for adult self-interest. Children are being confused in terrible ways, and changing the law to self-identify and identification of gender is going to ratchet that up. I will not comply with demands from trans activists. They can have my job, my career and my reputation, but I'm not going to comply with their demands that no one shall speak out for children on the possible harms of self-identification of gender and the harms of transitioning. All that is needed for the dangers of self-identification of gender to become entrenched in our children's lives is for people to do nothing about the proposed changes to the GRA. So please, speak out, find your nerves of steel.